We go to action movies for a rush for spectacle, explosion, and the fantasy of controlled chaos. We watch the hero dodge bullets, outrun fireballs, survive impossible odds, and we leave the theater entertained, not shaken. But what happens when the chaos isn't controlled? When a film crosses the line from adrenaline into trauma? There's a category of action film that doesn't just blur the line between fiction and reality, it tears right through it. These are not your typical blockbusters. They are the movies that made audiences physically ill. The ones where violence wasn't stylized, but suffocating. Where the line between acting and suffering felt disturbingly thin. Some were accused of glorifying revenge. Others were too bleak, too real, or too raw for distributors to handle. Censors intervened. Scenes vanished. Endings were rewritten. In a few cases, the films barely made it out alive, cut into versions that softened their most brutal truths. Or worse, buried them entirely. And yet, beneath the edits, behind the bans, there lingers a darker, unspoken version of these stories, one that studios tried to tame but could never fully erase. These weren't just action movies. They were war zones, psychological minefields, reflections of what violence actually does to the human body and to the human mind. Some of them you may have seen, but not in the form they were meant to be. Others were quietly shelved or faded into obscurity, but all of them left behind a trail of controversy, chaos, and whispers of something too real to be just fiction. Let's dive into 15 action films that almost didn't make it because they were just too real to be released. FACT Rolling Thunder, 1977. The revenge cut that went too far. At test screenings, audience members reportedly walked out in silence, some refusing to speak at all. Not because the film was bad, but because they were disturbed. Rolling Thunder was billed as a gritty revenge thriller, starring William Devane as a Vietnam POW returning to a country that no longer feels like home. When his wife and son are murdered and he loses his hand in a home invasion, he doesn't cry. He constructs a custom prosthetic and fills it with a hook. Directed by John Flynn, the original cut of the film leaned heavily into trauma realism. The violence wasn't stylized, it was intimate, quiet, and unnervingly precise. In one infamous scene, the protagonist tortures a suspect by calmly grinding his hook against the man's flesh. There was no music, no catharsis, just the raw mechanics of pain. 20th Century Fox panicked. They ordered severe edits before release, removing several sequences that they deemed emotionally damaging. The screenwriter, Paul Schrader, later claimed the studio had castrated the movie. Fans have long speculated about the lost footage, but no full original cut has ever surfaced. What remains is still a haunting film, but also a puzzle. A version that hints at something colder, more brutal, and more honest about what revenge really looks like. But this wasn't the only time an action film got too real about the cost of coming home. FACT-2. Who'll Stop the Rain? 1978. PTSD on film. Before the term existed, Dick. At a time when studios were selling war movies as heroic epics, this one told a different story. The war never ends. It just follows you home. Who'll Stop the Rain, based on Robert Stone's novel Dog Soldiers, follows a Vietnam vet, played by Nick Nolte, smuggling heroin into the U.S. It's not a clean-cut anti-hero arc, it's a slow descent into paranoia, addiction, and moral rot. The violence is fast and disorienting, like a flashback you can't wake up from. Director Carol Rice didn't soften the trauma. The film is drenched in sweat, dirt, and psychological collapse. Scenes of withdrawal, mistrust, and existential numbness unnerved early test audiences, many of whom were Vietnam vets themselves. Some said it was the first time they saw their experience on screen. Others walked out mid-screening. The MPAA pushed for edits, particularly regarding drug use and emotional collapse. Though the film did release theatrically, several distributors overseas refused to carry it, claiming it was anti-American or too bleak for commercial screening. It didn't bomb, but it vanished. For decades, the film was largely ignored, overshadowed by more palatable war stories. But those who saw it never forgot the unease it left behind. And it wouldn't be the last time a war film blurred into documentary-level trauma. Fact #3, 84 Charlie Mopic 1989. The mockumentary that felt too real. When it premiered, some viewers thought they were watching recovered combat footage. Others swore it was a real documentary the government had tried to suppress. 84. Charlie Mopic, short for Military Occupational Specialty Code. 84. C. Motion Picture Photographer. Was a fictional account of a reconnaissance unit in Vietnam, told entirely through the lens of a diegetic camera operator. It was the Blair Witch Project a decade earlier, and with bullets instead of ghosts. Filmed on a shoestring budget with mostly unknown actors, the movie employed long takes, overlapping dialogue, and authentic military jargon. There were no orchestral cues or dramatic hero shots, just confused yelling, shaking hands, and the kind of dead air that fills real war zones. The realism was so intense, some early viewers reported stress responses similar to those experienced by actual combat veterans. The Department of Defense issued no official response, but there were rumors never confirmed that military groups had lobbied to prevent wide theatrical distribution. The film saw limited release and was later picked up for niche home video markets, especially among film schools and indie circles. To this day, no mainstream distributor has attempted a re-release or remaster. It remains a cult object, a film that told too much truth, too soon. But sometimes, the danger didn't come from the subject matter, it came from what the film suggested about society itself. FACT #4. Cutter's Way. 1981. The anti-hero that made people uncomfortable. It wasn't the violence that disturbed audiences, it was the implication that no one in this film, not even the heroes, was truly clean. Cutter's Way begins like a noir thriller. A disillusioned veteran with one eye, one leg, and a haunted stare believes he's uncovered a murder conspiracy involving a local tycoon. But what unfolds is less a mystery than a slow disintegration of belief in justice, in truth, even in each other. Directed by Ivan Passer, the film paints post-Vietnam America not as triumphant, but as morally bankrupt. Jeff Bridges plays the passive friend pulled into a rabbit hole he doesn't want to see. John Hurd, as the titular Cutter, is volatile, alcoholic, and emotionally unstable, but also perhaps the only one who sees clearly. When the film was first screened, many test audiences responded with hostility. Some called it anti-American. Others simply couldn't accept a story where the truth doesn't matter and justice isn't served. United Artists delayed the release, then dumped it with minimal marketing under the alternate title Cutter and Bone. Critics would later praise it as a masterpiece of disillusionment. But at the time, it was too bitter, too accusatory, too real for audiences looking for escapism. Still, there were directors who didn't just question morality. They weaponized fate itself. Hafty #5 Sorcerer, 1977. The action film that induced existential dread. No explosions, no car chases. Just 4 men, each already dead inside, driving trucks full of nitroglycerin through the jungle and hoping the road doesn't kill them first. William Friedkin's Sorcerer was meant to be a tense, atmospheric remake of The Wages of Fear. What he delivered instead was a brutal odyssey into despair. The first 45 minutes contain almost no dialogue. Each character's introduction involves failure, shame, or death. Then comes the journey, a nightmare of rain-slick cliffs, collapsing bridges, and soul-level exhaustion. Friedkin insisted on filming in real jungles with real trucks. The actors performed on unstable rope bridges dangling over waterfalls. One truck nearly fell off. Crew members quit. Roy Scheider reportedly suffered minor breakdowns during filming. There was no glamour, only attrition. Critics at the time were baffled. Audiences, expecting something closer to The French Connection, recoiled. Universal cut the budget for marketing and reduced its theatrical run. The studio buried the film after its poor box office, especially as Star Wars released weeks later and changed everything. But decades later, Sorcerer has been rediscovered. Not as a commercial hit, but as a psychological landmine disguised as an action film. Next came a film so charged with metaphor, some states refused to screen it at all. Fact-6. Southern Comfort, 1981. The action allegory that got too close to home. A training mission turns into a massacre, but the real threat isn't the enemy. It's each other. In Southern Comfort, a squad of National Guard reservists conducting exercises in the Louisiana Bayou accidentally antagonize a group of local Cajuns. What begins as a misunderstanding escalates into ambushes, psychological collapse, and mutiny within the ranks. Walter Hill directed the film with the precision of a war movie, but the tension was all internal. The soldiers, ill-prepared, overconfident, and armed with blanks, fall apart the moment they realize they're being hunted. There's no external enemy to demonize, just terrain, trauma, and poor decisions. When the film was screened for regional censors and state film boards, some deemed it anti-military. Several southern states reportedly refused to screen it altogether. The military itself distanced from the project, and the studio avoided marketing it as a war film to minimize backlash. But for those who did see it, the message hit hard. The enemy isn't always out there. Sometimes, it's the ego inside the uniform. And in the next film, that truth became even harder to ignore. Fact-7. The Dogs of War, 1980. A film too honest about mercenaries. The most uncomfortable thing about The Dogs of War wasn't the violence, it was the professionalism of it. Killing wasn't personal, it was procedure. Starring Christopher Walken as a jaded photojournalist drawn into a corporate-sponsored coup in Africa. The film initially presents itself like a standard action vehicle. But what unfolds is a cold, surgical depiction of modern warfare, stripped of nationalism, ideology, or even emotion. Director John Irvin, a veteran of war documentaries, staged firefights with an eerie detachment. No sweeping music, no slow-motion heroics, just practiced men doing ugly jobs for profit. In one chilling scene, Walken's character teaches local rebels how to manufacture improvised explosives using fertilizer and sugar step by step with deadpan clarity. When screened for international distributors, several European markets flagged the film for excessive paramilitary detail. American censors requested edits, particularly in scenes showing executions and torture, claiming it blurred the line between fiction and military instruction. The film was cut by nearly 12 minutes before its U.S. release. The original version, now known as the UK Uncut, contains several scenes still banned from certain broadcasters. The Dogs of War didn't just depict conflict, it detailed the commodification of it. And that made it dangerous. But few films pushed closer to the edge than the original ending of Rambo. Fact-First Blood, 1982. The ending that studios buried. Before he became a franchise icon, Rambo died, and it was supposed to feel like mercy. In the original cut of First Blood, John Rambo doesn't survive the final confrontation. Instead of surrendering, he begs Colonel Troutman to end it, and Troutman obliges, shooting him in cold blood. The scene was shot, scored, even previewed. But when test audiences reacted with gasps, silence, and visible distress, the studio panicked. Executives feared they'd just killed their own IP before it began. The film was re-edited with a more ambiguous ending. Rambo lives, walks out in handcuffs, and a potential franchise is born. Director Ted Kotcheff later described the original cut as devastating but honest. It showed a man broken by war, chewed up by the country he served, finally begging to stop feeling. The performance from Stallone, restrained, shattered, was a far cry from the muscle-bound mythos that would follow in the sequels. The original ending still exists and has surfaced on DVD extras, but it's rarely discussed and even more rarely shown in public screenings. Because it wasn't the action that shocked people, it was the quiet. Next came a film whose emotional impact was louder than any gunshot. Fact #9. The Deer Hunter, 1978. The scene that was too real for its own good. It was one of the most iconic and controversial moments in cinema history. A scene that people still argue never should have been filmed. The Deer Hunter follows a group of Pennsylvania steelworkers sent to Vietnam, only to return forever altered. Its most infamous sequence takes place in a POW camp, where the soldiers are forced to play Russian roulette for their captors' amusement. The tension is unbearable. The camera lingers. There's no music, no relief, just clicks and screams and blood. Audiences reportedly fainted. Others walked out. Critics called it psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. What made it worse? There was no historical evidence that such roulette games ever occurred in Vietnam. Many Vietnamese American groups protested the scene as racist fabrication, but director Michael Cimino defended it as metaphor, a representation of the randomness and cruelty of war. Censors in several countries demanded cuts. The scene was shortened in some international releases, while others, like Sweden and South Korea, banned the film outright for several years. And yet, despite or because of the backlash, the film won 5 Academy Awards. The Deer Hunter didn't aim for realism. It aimed for trauma, and it hit its mark. But some films went even further by abandoning fiction altogether. Fact #0. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. The director's meltdown on Filminence. Sam Peckinpah didn't just direct this film. He exorcised something onto celluloid, and it nearly ruined him. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia opens like a grim fairy tale. A Mexican crime boss offers a bounty for the severed head of the man who seduced his daughter. What follows is a filthy, fevered road movie where Warren Oates, playing a down-on-his-luck piano player, descends into heat, blood, and madness, dragging a literal head in a burlap sack through the desert. By the time filming began, Peckinpah was deep in alcoholism and paranoia. He shot scenes in sweltering Mexican heat, demanding grittier takes, more sweat, more degradation. Oates later claimed he wasn't acting, just trying to survive. Several crew members quit. Others were hospitalized for exhaustion. The film's violence isn't clean or choreographed. It's ugly, sloppy. There are beatings that linger too long, gunfights that feel like breakdowns, and a finale that's more nihilistic than cathartic. When the film premiered, critics recoiled. Studios buried it. The few who praised it called it a suicide note in celluloid. Years later, it gained a cult following, but even then, it divided audiences. Some saw it as genius, others as a breakdown masquerading as cinema. Either way, it's one of the rare action films where the real pain wasn't in the script, it was in the director's eyes. But not all films were tormented from the inside. Some were haunted by what they tried to depict too directly. Fact Hajan 1, Sniper 1993. The cut scene that disappeared without a trace. On paper, Sniper was a simple military thriller. Tom Berenger plays an elite marksman navigating jungle warfare with a rookie partner. But buried inside the original script and rumored to have been filmed was a scene so controversial it never made it past the first rough cut. Multiple crew members later hinted at a sequence involving a sniper shot on a civilian hostage ordered by a corrupt commanding officer. The victim? A teenager used as bait. The scene reportedly showed the bullet's impact in slow motion, followed by several seconds of silence and the sniper vomiting. According to editor interviews, the footage was removed before test audiences ever saw it. The studio feared not just backlash, but a change in the film's genre identity. Sniper was supposed to be tense, not tragic. Years later, fans noticed jump cuts in the timeline and missing context in Berenger's character arc. Some believe the cut scene still exists in an archived workprint. Others argue it was never finished. Either way, the moment real or apocryphal continues to hang over the film like a blank space in the crosshairs. But sometimes, it wasn't just one scene, it was the entire film that became a scream too loud to ignore. Fact Hajan 2, Combat Shock 1984. The film so bleak, it was mistaken for propaganda. There's a line between hopelessness and exploitation, and Combat Shock doesn't just cross it, it obliterates it. Directed by Buddy Giovinazzo on a shoestring budget, the film follows a Vietnam vet wandering the decaying streets of Staten Island. He's jobless, hallucinating, caring for a chemically deformed infant, and spiraling into madness. There are no missions, no redemption arcs, only poverty, trauma, and despair. Filmed in real derelict buildings using guerrilla tactics, the movie captures a level of urban rot that critics described as emotionally unwatchable. The gun violence feels random, the blood looks real, the sound design is oppressive, and the final scene, still censored in some versions, shows the protagonist murdering his family before taking his own life. When Combat Shock was submitted to the MPAA, it was initially rated X, not for sex, but for relentless psychological damage. Distributors trimmed several scenes, especially those involving the infant and drug withdrawal. Even then, most theaters refused to carry it. Some assumed it was an anti-American propaganda film produced overseas. The irony? Giovinazzo made the film as a love letter to forgotten veterans. But what he captured was too raw, too ugly, and too close to a reality no one wanted to claim. And yet, there were still darker truths waiting on the edge of fiction. Fact Hajan 3, Men Behind the Sun 1988. The film people thought was real. It was supposed to be history, but many believed it was snuff. Men Behind the Sun, a Hong Kong-produced war film directed by T.F. Mo, depicts the atrocities committed by Japan's Unit 731 during World War II. Though not technically an action film, its intensity and graphic nature placed it in the same category of taboo cinema that pushed realism beyond audience comfort. Using a quasi-documentary style, the film stages autopsies, vivisections, and medical torture with such detail that multiple markets refused to classify it at all. A scene involving the dissection of a young boy led to urban legends that real cadavers were used. Another involving rats eating a restrained victim was so convincing that animal cruelty accusations surfaced. Though the director insisted everything was faked, the line between practical effect and potential war crime recreation became too blurry. In some countries, the film was banned not for its content, but for fear that its realism would incite psychological harm. To this day, Men Behind the Sun is still censored or unreleased in over a dozen countries. And while it's often filed under exploitation, its impact is more enduring. A film that forced audiences to confront horrors they would rather believe were fiction. But even the post-apocalyptic couldn't shield audiences from emotional devastation. Fact 4. Threads, 1984. The TV movie that scarred a generation. There are action films that thrill. There are war films that shock. And then there's Threads, a made-for-TV movie that left British audiences weeping in silence. Commissioned by the BBC, Threads imagined a full-scale nuclear war between NATO and the Soviet Union and the unflinching aftermath in Sheffield, England. But what sets it apart isn't the explosion. It's what comes after. Famine, radiation poisoning, social collapse, and generations born into trauma. Shot with a cinema verite style, Threads offered no score, no heroism, and no closure. Mothers give birth in rubble. Children are orphaned, mutated, feral. The government ceases to exist. Viewers tuned in expecting Cold War tension and were instead shown civilization ending in real time. Despite being a TV movie, the fallout was massive. Psychologists reported spikes in anxiety. Teachers showed it in classrooms, then faced backlash from parents. In the U.S., it was edited before airing. In the U.K., it aired once uncut, then vanished from prime time for nearly 2 decades. To this day, Threads is cited not just as a warning, but as a trauma. One that blurred the line between drama and mass emotional event. But even this wasn't the end. Some films struck so close to real-world crimes, they were forced into the shadows. Fact 5. The Kill Team, 2019. Fiction too close to fact. Sometimes, the real story is worse than the movie. But The Kill Team got close, maybe too close. Based on the true account of a 2010 U.S. Army scandal in Afghanistan, where soldiers were found guilty of murdering civilians for sport. This adaptation, directed by Dan Krause, who also made the original documentary, attempts to dramatize the inner descent of a young soldier into complicity. Unlike typical war films, The Kill Team avoids spectacle. There are no sweeping action sequences. Violence is sudden, awkward, and disturbing. One key scene where the unit leader calmly plants a grenade beside a corpse reportedly caused several audience members to leave during festival screenings. But the controversy wasn't just cinematic. The Pentagon declined to cooperate. Several military bases banned internal screenings. Veteran groups protested that the film portrayed U.S. troops as murderers rather than victims of broken command structures. Internationally, some streaming platforms refused to carry the title, citing concerns over politically sensitive portrayals of real incidents. The film never reached wide theatrical release. Its poster vanished from multiplexes within weeks. And yet, for those who did see it, The Kill Team wasn't fiction, it was a confession. But there was still one story left, one too strange to even make the main list. Bonus fact: Dead Presidents, 1995. The ending they tried to soften. This one didn't make the top 15, but it might just be the strangest of all. Dead Presidents, directed by the Hughes brothers, is a heist film on the surface, but beneath it lies something far more raw. A condemnation of how America treats its veterans, especially black veterans. Following a young man from his teenage years through Vietnam and back into a society that offers him nothing, the film descends from idealism into bitterness. The war scenes are gritty, unrelenting, and graphic, but it's the return home that hurts more. The protagonist, unable to find work or dignity, plans a robbery not out of greed, but out of despair. What most viewers don't know is that the original ending was even darker. According to early drafts and cast interviews, the Hughes brothers considered closing the film with the main character setting himself on fire in a church, an act of protest drawn from real-life accounts of ignored veterans in the 1,970 seconds. Studio executives objected. The final scene was changed to a courtroom monologue, powerful, yes, but sanitized. Still, Dead Presidents was attacked by critics as too angry, too political, or too hopeless. Its theatrical run was short. Promotional materials were pulled from some major chains. And while the film has gained cult status in recent years, the full original ending has never been released. Some say it was never shot. Others claim a rough cut exists, stored, appropriately, in a vault. So now we ask, were these films punished for being too violent, or for being too honest? When does realism in action cinema stop being entertainment and start becoming something audiences aren't ready to face? Tell us, which of these films do you think deserve to be seen in its rawest, unedited form? And is there a film you watched once and never wanted to see again? We'll be watching the comments.